The rain fell steadily over the small Cornish town, drumming against the tiled roofs and narrow lanes. Martha Ellison stood in the doorway of the little cottage that had been her home for over 30 years. The garden she once tended with such care was overgrown, wild roses creeping along the broken fence. Her hands, marked with the lines of age, clutched a single leather suitcase. Behind her, the rooms lay bare. The photographs had been packed away, the curtains taken down. The warmth of her husband George's laughter no longer lingered in the walls. George had been gone for 5 years, yet the house had always carried his memory. Now, even that was being taken from her. The landlord had been polite enough when he told her the news. The land was being sold to developers. Rows of identical modern houses would soon replace her beloved cottage. She had pleaded for time, but time was not hers to keep. A car horn sounded outside. Her daughter, Helen, leaned out of the driver's window, her expression impatient rather than sympathetic. "Come on, Mum, we'll be late if we don't leave now." Martha turned back one last time. Her eyes swept across the cracked hearthstone, the faded wallpaper, the empty hooks by the door where George once hung his coat. A lump rose in her throat, but no tears came. She had cried them all. Locking the door with a trembling hand, Martha slid the iron key beneath the mat, as the landlord had asked. The cottage no longer belonged to her. With a slow breath, she walked towards the car. As Helen drove them away, Martha pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window. The lane curved, and the house slipped from sight. It was as if a part of her life had been sealed shut forever. Yet somewhere deep within her, a voice whispered that this was not the end. Something waited for her beyond this goodbye, something she could not yet name. The road to Winchester stretched long and grey beneath the drizzle. Helen's voice filled the silence, sharp and brisk as she spoke about deadlines, meetings, and her husband James's promotion. Martha nodded where expected, but her thoughts wandered back to the cottage she had left behind. When the car finally turned into the wide drive of Helen's modern home, Martha felt the weight of distance settle on her chest. The house was large, glass-fronted, with neatly trimmed hedges and a gleaming black door. Yet for all its brightness, it felt cold, an empty shell dressed in polish. James appeared at the doorway, tall and stiff, his tie loosened but his eyes guarded. He carried Martha's suitcase inside with a strained politeness, setting it down at the bottom of the stairs. "We've made up the small room in the loft for you," he said. "It's quiet up there. You'll have everything you need." The loft. Martha's heart sank. She had imagined perhaps a little guest room, something near the family, not a cramped space under the eaves. But she smiled faintly, unwilling to protest. Upstairs, the air was stuffy. The slanted ceiling pressed low, and a single small window looked out onto the street below. The bed was narrow, the mattress thin. A folded blanket lay at the foot, smelling faintly of mothballs. Martha set her handbag on the bed and ran her hand across the worn fabric. This was her new beginning, she told herself. She would not complain. Downstairs, the sound of laughter floated up, the laughter of her grandson, Daniel. Martha's lips curved into a hopeful smile, and she made her way carefully down the stairs. Daniel was in the sitting room, hunched over a glowing screen, his headphones clamped tight. Helen hovered nearby, reminding him about homework. Martha stepped forward, her heart aching with warmth. "Hello, darling," she said softly. Daniel glanced up for the briefest moment. "Hi, Grandma," he muttered, before turning back to his screen. The warmth faltered. Helen caught her mother's eye and shrugged as if to say, "You see how it is." For the rest of the evening, Martha sat quietly in the corner of the sitting room, invisible amidst the noise of the household. The walls gleamed, the furniture shone, but nothing in that house carried the pulse of home. And as she went back up to her narrow bed in the loft, Martha realized with a slow, aching certainty that she had not been brought here to belong. She had been brought here to be placed away. The days in Winchester soon blurred into a quiet routine. Martha rose early, before the rest of the household stirred. She made tea in silence, careful not to take up space in Helen's gleaming kitchen. She folded laundry, washed dishes, and sometimes cooked stews the way George used to like them. Yet the family barely noticed. Helen left each morning in a flurry of car keys and phone calls. James buried himself in work behind a closed study door. Daniel vanished into his world of screens. Martha floated at the edges, her presence tolerated rather than welcomed. One Saturday, Helen suggested she might get some fresh air, and pointed Martha towards the town market. With her coat buttoned against the crisp wind, Martha walked slowly through the cobbled streets until the scent of roasted chestnuts and the cries of vendors reached her ears. The market was alive with color. Stalls overflowed with handmade pottery, knitted scarves, and second-hand books whose pages smelled faintly of dust and time. For the first time in weeks, Martha felt her steps lighten. She lingered at a stall piled high with old trinkets and brass ornaments. Among the clutter lay a small object that drew her eye, a tarnished silver key attached to a faded tag. The writing was nearly worn away, but she could still make out the words scratched in ink, Willowbrook Cottage. Her fingers closed around the key. It was heavier than it looked, and oddly warm in her palm, as though it had been waiting. "How much for this?" Martha asked the vendor. The old man squinted. "That thing? Oh, just £1. Found it in a box from a house clearance years ago. Nobody's ever wanted it." Martha handed him the coin. She slipped the key into her coat pocket, her heart beating strangely fast. As she walked back through the crowded market, the world around her seemed unchanged, yet something deep within her shifted. The name on the tag echoed in her mind, Willowbrook Cottage. A place she had never heard of, but one that suddenly felt as though it belonged to her. That night, in the narrow bed of the loft, Martha held the key in her hand beneath the blankets. The cold metal pressed into her skin, steady and real. For the first time since leaving her own cottage, she felt the faint stirrings of hope. But she also felt something else, something she could not quite name, a pull, as though the key was pointing her towards a door that was waiting to be found. The next morning dawned pale and still, the sky stretched wide above the roofs of Winchester. Martha sat at the kitchen table with her tea growing cold in her hands. The key lay hidden in her pocket, its weight pressing gently against her side, as if reminding her it was there. Helen bustled about, gathering files and tapping hurried messages on her phone. She barely looked up as she said, "Mum, we'll be out late tonight. There's leftover pasta in the fridge if you get hungry." Martha nodded, though no one really waited for her reply. She climbed the stairs to her loft room and, once alone, drew out the key. Turning it over in the light, she studied the worn engraving on the tag. Willowbrook Cottage. The name tugged at her. She could not explain why, but she felt certain it was more than a trinket. It was a direction. By midday, she found herself at the local library, her footsteps echoing in the hushed aisles. She asked the librarian, a kindly man with wire spectacles, whether there was any record of a place called Willowbrook Cottage. He searched for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Ah, yes. There's a Willowbrook Cottage in a little village called Ashcombe. It's not far, just across the Hampshire border. Quiet place. Hardly on the map these days. Ashcombe." The name felt like a whisper carried by the wind. That night, when the household settled into silence, Martha lay awake in her narrow bed. She pictured the road that led out of the city, the green fields rolling beyond, the promise of a village she had never seen. Her heart beat faster than it had in years. The thought was reckless, an old woman chasing the ghost of a name carved on a key. Yet deep inside, she knew she had to go. As dawn crept over Winchester once more, Martha slipped the key into her handbag. She would take the bus, she decided. Just to see. Just to find the place where the key belonged. The thought both frightened and thrilled her. She was no longer only waiting in the shadows of her daughter's house. She was moving toward something unknown, yet calling her all the same. The bus rattled along narrow country lanes, past rolling meadows and hedgerows heavy with hawthorn. Martha sat by the window, her handbag clutched tightly on her lap, the silver key resting inside. Each turn of the wheels carried her further from Winchester and closer to the unknown. When the bus finally stopped, she stepped down onto a quiet lane bordered by ancient oaks. A wooden sign stood at the crossroads, the paint faded but legible. Ashcombe. The village was small, no more than a handful of cottages clustered around a square. Stone houses leaned with age, their gardens bursting with lavender and hollyhocks. Smoke curled from chimneys, carrying the scent of wood smoke and bread. It was as though time had slowed, holding this place gently in its palm. Martha wandered through the square, her steps tentative. She passed the post office, the inn with its creaking sign, and a tiny shop whose window displayed jars of honey and fresh loaves. The villagers glanced at her with polite curiosity, nodding as she walked by. Her heart quickened when she reached the far end of the lane. There, half hidden by ivy and wild hedges, stood a wrought iron gate. Rust flaked from its bars, yet it held a quiet dignity. A small plaque on the gatepost bore a name, nearly swallowed by moss. She brushed it clean with trembling fingers. Willowbrook Cottage. Martha froze. The letters gleamed faintly in the sunlight, as though the cottage had been waiting for her. She pushed the gate open. It groaned in protest, revealing a path choked with grass and nettles. Beyond, the cottage rose from the shadows of the trees. Its stone walls were weathered, the windows shuttered, the roof sagging slightly under the weight of years. And yet, despite its neglect, Martha felt a jolt of recognition. She had never set foot here before, yet the place seemed to breathe with familiarity. Her hand slid into her bag, closing around the key. For a long moment, she stood there at the threshold, her pulse racing. The cottage door waited in silence, the lock dark and old. Could the key truly belong here? Martha stood before the door, her breath caught in her chest. The ivy clung thick to the stone walls, the silence of the garden pressing close around her. With trembling fingers, she pulled out the silver key, its surface glinting faintly even beneath the shade. She pressed it into the lock. For a moment, it resisted, as though the door itself was testing her resolve. Then, with a sharp click, it turned. The sound echoed through the air, startling a blackbird from the branches above. Martha pushed the door slowly. It creaked, swinging inward to reveal a hallway bathed in dust and shadow. Inside, the air was thick and stale, heavy with the scent of old wood and forgotten years. Cobwebs veiled the corners. A coat stand leaned against the wall, still holding a single moth-eaten scarf. The floorboards groaned beneath her cautious steps. Her eyes traveled across faded wallpaper, once patterned with roses, now pale and peeling. A grandfather clock stood silent in the corner, its pendulum frozen mid-swing. And yet, despite the neglect, there was warmth here, a sense of presence, as if the house had simply been waiting for someone to return. Martha's hands trembled as she brushed dust from a table by the window. A photograph rested there, its frame tarnished but intact. She lifted it gently, her heart leaping. It was a picture of a family she did not recognize, a man and woman with 2 children, smiling stiffly in front of the very same cottage. Their clothes suggested another time, perhaps the 1930s. But it was not their faces that unsettled her. It was the garden behind them. For there, standing among the roses, was a figure almost hidden in the blur of the photograph. An old woman, watching from the shadows. Her eyes, though faint on the faded print, seemed to meet Martha's own. Martha lowered the frame, her pulse hammering in her ears. She was not sure if it was a trick of the light, or something else entirely. And then, from somewhere deep inside the house, came the faintest sound. A whisper of movement. She was not alone. Martha froze in the dim hallway, her ears straining. The sound had been soft, so soft she could almost dismiss it as the groan of old wood. Yet her heart told her otherwise. "Hello." Her voice wavered, swallowed quickly by the silence. No reply came. She stepped deeper into the cottage. Dust motes swirled in the air where her movement disturbed them, glimmering faintly in the pale light spilling through cracked shutters. Each step felt heavier, as though the floor was drawing her inward. The sound came again, a faint scuff, like a shoe brushing across stone. It seemed to come from the parlor beyond. With a steadying breath, Martha pushed the parlor door. It swung open on reluctant hinges. Inside, the room was lined with shelves bowing under the weight of forgotten books. An armchair slumped by the fireplace, its fabric worn thin. But it was the air that struck her most, an unmistakable sense that the room had not been empty, that someone had stood here only moments before. Her gaze swept across the dust-coated floor, and her heart jolted. Footprints. Fresh ones. Leading from the hearth towards the far corner. Martha's throat tightened. She followed them with her eyes, half afraid of what she might see. But the prints ended at the wall, as though the figure had simply vanished into it. The silence pressed in again. The cottage seemed to breathe around her, each creak and sigh carrying its own weight of memory. On the mantel above the hearth, she noticed a small wooden box. Drawn to it, Martha reached out and brushed away the dust. The lid bore a carving of a single willow tree, its branches arched like a veil. Her fingers hesitated, then lifted the lid. Inside lay a folded letter, the paper yellowed with age. She unfolded it with care, her hands trembling. The writing was faded but still legible. To the one who finds this key. Willowbrook is not empty. It remembers. And it chooses who may stay. Martha's breath caught. The words seemed meant for her, though written decades earlier. And then came the sound once more, this time unmistakable. A faint sigh, directly behind her. She spun around. The parlor was empty. Martha's pulse hammered as she gripped the letter, the silence closing in thick around her. Though the room was empty, she could not shake the feeling of eyes upon her. Gathering her courage, she folded the paper carefully, slipped it back into the box, and set it on the mantel. Then she left the parlor, her footsteps quick upon the boards. The air of the cottage seemed to ease as she stepped outside once more, as though it had released her, for now. The sunlight of Ashcombe Square felt blinding after the shadows of Willowbrook. Martha drew a steadying breath and looked around. Villagers were passing by, a man with a wheelbarrow of apples, children chasing one another across the green. It was ordinary, safe. And yet she carried the weight of the cottage with her. She wandered into the inn at the center of the square, its sign creaking gently in the breeze. Inside, the smell of ale and roasted meat warmed the air. Behind the counter stood a woman with sharp eyes softened by kindness. "Good afternoon," the woman said, wiping her hands on her apron. "You're new here." "Passing through, are you?" Martha hesitated. I've come to see Willowbrook Cottage." The innkeeper's smile faltered just slightly. "Ah. Willowbrook." She lowered her voice, leaning closer. "Not many ask after that place these days." Martha clasped her handbag, the key hidden inside. "Do you know it well?" The woman's gaze flicked towards the window, as if to be sure no one else was listening. "We call it the waiting house. It's been empty for decades. Some say cursed, others say chosen. People who go there either find peace or they leave shaken. No one stays long." A shiver traced Martha's spine. "And the family who once lived there?" The innkeeper's eyes grew distant. "The Whitcombs. They vanished during the war. Never returned. Some whisper their spirits linger, watching, waiting. But it's only talk, of course." Martha's hands tightened on her bag. The letter's words burned in her mind, it remembers. And it chooses. The innkeeper gave her a long look. Best not to meddle too deep, love. That house, it keeps its own. But Martha knew, with an unshakable certainty, that Willowbrook had already chosen her. And she was not sure whether that truth filled her with wonder, or dread. That night, Martha could not sleep. She lay in the small bed at the Ashcombe Inn, the silence of the village outside pressing gently against the windows. Yet in her heart, the cottage called to her, steady, insistent, like a voice in the dark. Near midnight, she rose. She dressed quietly, slipped the silver key into her coat pocket, and stepped into the chill of the night. The moonlight silvered the cobblestones as she made her way back down the lane towards Willowbrook. The gate stood open, just as she had left it. The air within the garden was hushed, waiting. Martha pushed forward, her steps certain now, drawn as if by invisible threads. When she reached the door, she did not hesitate. The key slid into the lock as though it had always belonged there. The door opened soundlessly, welcoming her. Inside, the air felt different, lighter, warmer, as though the cottage had been expecting her return. Shadows bent softly along the walls, no longer menacing, but familiar. The parlor greeted her with the faint glow of the hearth, though no fire burned. On the mantel, the wooden box remained, its willow tree carved in quiet dignity. She touched it, feeling a calm spread through her chest. Then she heard it, the soft murmur of voices. Not threatening, but gentle, like the echo of lives once lived within these walls. She followed the sound through the rooms, where faded furniture and forgotten trinkets seemed to awaken under her gaze. In the kitchen, she paused. A shape stirred at the edge of sight, an old woman, her features blurred, her form faint as mist. The same figure from the photograph. Martha's breath caught, but she felt no fear. The woman's eyes, dark yet kind, met hers. And then a whisper rose in Martha's mind, not spoken, but understood. You have come home. A warmth bloomed in her heart, washing away years of loneliness and rejection. The cottage had chosen her, not out of chance, but out of need. It remembered, and in her it found someone who would care for it once more. Tears welled in Martha's eyes. I'll stay, she whispered aloud. If you'll have me. The silence that followed was not empty, but full of belonging. The floor beneath her feet steadied, the walls seemed to sigh with relief, and the air carried the faint scent of roses long gone. For the first time in many years, Martha no longer felt adrift. She had a place. She had been chosen. As the moonlight poured through the windows, Martha sat in the old parlor, the silver key resting in her palm. And though the cottage stood in silence, she knew she was not alone. Willowbrook had its keeper once more.